Enough of that. Guys, what is up? The Chibson is finished, and boy, do we have some things to talk about. So if you are new to the channel and you aren't familiar with this guitar, I strongly urge you to first go and check out the video that maybe up here somewhere where I introduced this thing and kind of went over what it was like straight out of the box and what plans I had for it. So Cliff Notes, I wanted a flying V, and I decided to roll the dice on a $275 Chinese Epiphone Prophecy V clone. To keep my cost low, I used a lot of existing hardware and pickups that I had laying around, and I installed sort of a mid-priced $60 set of Hipshot locking tuners and took it to my luthier in town for an inspection. Now, assuming that it passed his inspection, it was going to get a new bone nut and whatever fretwork was needed. The replacement pickups would get wired up with new CTS pots and a switchcraft jack and a pickup selector and a Faber bridge that I previously had on my Tokai. Basically every piece of hardware on this guitar was complete junk, and the Geiker roller bridge that I ordered before the guitar actually got here, it ended up using the smaller M4 studs, so this probably will be used on another guitar somewhere in the future down the line, and I'll end up having to grab the M8 stud bridge here to fit into this guitar, but for now the factory bridge is okay. Alright, I will go ahead and cut to the part that you probably care the most about, and that's whether or not I think that this project was worth it. How much it ended up costing, and ultimately, is this a project that you should dig into? The answer is kind of complicated, so let's sort of start at the beginning here. So like I mentioned in my first video on this thing, buying Chinese clones is very much a crapshoot, and Epiphones PRS SEs and other Chinese-made guitars from big brands, they go through an extra layer of QC. I mean, that's kind of part of the added cost of those instruments. With these though, you really don't know what you're going to get, and most of the sellers, they do not accept refunds if something is wrong. It seems like sort of universally across the board with these Chinese guitars, most of the hardware and electronics are absolute trash, and based on what my luthier told me and several other Chibson videos here on YouTube, almost all of them need some sort of fretwork, a new nut or finish work or something like that. The cost of getting something like this to a point at which it's equal to the more expensive version of the Prophecy EV in this instance, and its playability and the setup, making all that on par with the Epiphone, very much relies on you already having some spare hardware you can throw at this, and if you're comfortable doing like pickup wiring and fretwork and stuff like that yourself. I'm really heavily emphasizing all of that last part there because if you're not comfortable cutting a new nut and working on frets and you end up needing to take it to a shop for a pro to do that work, I think the cost of the luthier's bench time could very well push you kind of beyond what you would have otherwise spent just buying the Epiphone version. That's sort of the overarching conclusion I've come to with this project. These can be great bargains, assuming that the neck is straight and the truss rod works and there aren't any major issues like cracks in the headstock or the neck joint or anything like that, and that you can do some of this work yourself, or maybe have an experienced friend who won't charge you an arm and a leg for some of that more complicated setup work. If you're really just looking for like an inexpensive guitar that you can just sort of take out of the box and start playing, these probably are not for you. Okay, so how much did all of this cost me? Let's go through all of the parts that are on this and the luthier's fees and things like that. Now for the guitar itself, I paid $291 shipped. The locking tuners were $73 shipped. The Motor City Detroiter pickup that I have here in the bridge, I already owned it, but that would have been $130 if I didn't, and I'll sort of put that over in a separate area on the screen. The Duncan 59 in the neck, it was already in my box of parts, but it would have been $100 if I had bought that new. The Faber tailpiece I already had also, but that would have been $55 otherwise. The CTS pots, the Switchcraft jack, and the Switchcraft pickup selector, I already had all of those, and all of those would have otherwise totaled about $50. And lastly, for the components, since the factory knobs didn't fit the larger CTS shafts, I did order a new set of knobs. That was $15, and that brings my total out-of-pocket hardware cost, including the guitar, to $379. If I didn't have any of those extra components, the cost total would have been $714. But again, if you're doing something like this, you don't need expensive pickups, and you certainly don't need a $55 tailpiece. You could easily get by with a set of like maybe $30 Goto or maybe Wilkinson non-locking tuners, or maybe some used ones or something like that. Literally anything would have been better than the absolute trash tuners that came on this guitar. The one thing that I would not kind of cut cost on are the potentiometers, the switch, and the jack. I mean, those really aren't expensive, and I think that they're worth the few extra bucks over some generic parts that you might get for a couple of dollars less. Now that we've gone over the cost of all the parts and we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the bench work. I paid the guys at my shop $460 to wire up the pickups and the switch and the new input jack, to cut the new nut and glue down the fret ends that were coming up, and to re-glue a section of the neck binding right around here that was coming off, and kind of to do some touch-up work with some of the frets, along with a final polishing of all of the frets. After that, they strung it up, set the intonation and the neck relief right where it needed to be. They adjusted the bridge so that the action was where I like it also. I mean, it was a lot of work, and I could have done probably the electronics myself to save some money, but I'm really a big proponent of supporting local businesses for this type of stuff, and I knew that when I got the guitar back, it was going to be as perfect as the instrument could be. So my total out-of-pocket cost ended up being right around $839. The cost of the Epiphone, $800. It's about as close to a break-even point as possible, and that $800 is without tax. So it was very, very close in terms of the cost of this project with the parts and the finishing and all that, compared to just buying the Epiphone. If I didn't have any spare parts, that cost would have been $1,200. So again, my point in all this is that if you have the spare parts and you know how to do some or all of that extra setup and the finishing work, it can be a way to end up with a great instrument at probably a much lower cost than what you would end up spending on the Epiphone. And there's no guarantee that the Epiphone is going to show up in perfect condition and perfectly playable either. Also, speaking of the Epiphone prophecy, if you're like me and you really aren't a fan of the Fishman Fluence pickups, that's an extra purchase that you would still be looking at making to get your own set of pickups that you would rather have to replace those Fishmans. So that's sort of my conclusion on this project. It was just about a break-even point for me personally, but I think that I ended up with a guitar that sounds the way I want it to sound. It's wired with a pair of volume knobs in a way that I want the controls to be. It has a perfectly cut nut, a professional fret job and setup, and most importantly, it plays really, really well. And best of all, it sounds awesome. So that is the Chibson V, and yet another guitar that really doesn't fit in my rack over there. So I will have to come up with something, but for now, it's just sort of been hanging out behind me on this handy clamp hanger thing right here behind me. Now, as for the post-gig report, don't worry, that will actually be coming in a separate video probably early next week, because I'm going to be taking this and the new little Synergy, the IR20 and the Friedman BE Deluxe module, going to be taking those on stage. So I will give you guys a full post-gig rundown on this guitar during that video. Now I can already hear you, and I can read your minds. How does this thing actually compare to a real Epiphone Prophecy V? Well, this is going to the gig also. And if you want to know how they compare and you're not subscribed, consider subscribing to my channel to kind of help me grow, and you'll be able to catch all of the latest videos when they get uploaded. More subscribers translates into more opportunities to work with these companies, and that translates into hopefully more educational and at least quasi-entertaining content for you guys. Okay, I'm out. I will see you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye.